Mikhail Tal built his legend on attacks nobody survived. Watch closely, because here, someone quietly turns that same magic against him. Savon opens with a pawn to d4, a calm, classical, no hint yet of a storm. Across the board sits Tal, the magician of Riga. This is the Soviet Championship, 1969. He answers, knight to f6. A second pawn climbs to c4, white claiming space on the wing. In response, a black pawn steps to e6, opening a quiet lane for the bishop. Out steps the knight to f3, Savon developing without a wasted move. Striking back, Tal pushes a pawn to c5 at the heart of the board. Rather than rush, white underpins the center with a modest pawn to e3. Releasing the tension, black's pawn captures on d4 and cracks the center. White takes back on d4, keeping the pawns clean and the lines straight. Reaching wide, Tal plays a pawn to b6, clearing the long diagonal for his bishop. Eyeing ahead, Savon's bishop slides to d3 toward the king's future home. His bishop settles on b7, raking down that same diagonal. Unhurried, Savon castles, tucking his king into the corner. Solid as ever, Tal's bishop comes to e7, simple and sound. The last knight jumps to c3, Savon completing his setup. Staking the center, black thrusts a pawn to d5, meeting Savon head-on. On comes the bishop to g5, Savon pinning the knight against the queen. Clearing lines, black's pawn takes on c4. Back comes the bishop to c4, white's pieces humming with purpose. At last black castles, both kings finally tucked away. Quietly, Savon lifts the queen to e2, stacking force behind the center. Developing with purpose, Tal's knight jumps to c6, pressing the d4 pawn. Onto the open file glides a rook to d1, Savon piling on pressure. Prodding forward, black's knight hops to b4, poking at the bishop. Watch this, Savon plants a knight on e5, a bold outpost deep in Tal's half. Rerouting, Tal lands the knight on d5, trying to blunt white's initiative. Here's the idea, the rook climbs to d3, lifting off the back rank toward the king. Seeking trades, black snaps off the knight on c3 to ease the pressure. Taking back with the pawn on c3, Savon bends his structure but keeps the attack. Leaping in, Tal's knight bounds to e4, planting itself in the center. Patiently, Savon retreats the bishop to c1, regrouping for the next wave. Dropping back, black's knight retreats to d6, guarding and waiting. From distance the bishop swings to b3, aiming at Tal's king. Contesting the file, Tal brings a rook to c8, bracing for trouble. And now the hammer, the rook swings all the way to h3, joining the assault. Plugging the lines, black's bishop slides to e4 to slow the storm. Savon's second bishop swings to a3, locking onto the knight on d6. Pulling back, Tal's bishop retreats to g6, guarding the squares near his king. Slowly the pawns advance, g4 launched, the storm gathering over Tal's king. Shoring up, black lifts a rook to c7 as the danger mounts. Another pawn rolls to f4, Savon's wave swelling toward the king. Scrambling for play, Tal's queen shifts to c8, hunting any counterchance. Then it begins, Savon's knight smashes into g6, trading itself to shatter the king's cover. Forced to recapture, black's pawn takes on g6, but the king's wall is cracking. Crashing in, the bishop takes on d6, removing the knight that shielded Tal's king. Recapturing, black's bishop takes on d6, yet the defenders keep vanishing. Coldly, the queen slides to e1, Savon loading his last attacker. But Tal slips, his rook drifts to e8, when holding the bishop on e7 would have guarded the king far better. Pouncing, Savon swings the queen to h4, lining up on the exposed king. Sidestepping, Tal's king shuffles to f8, hunting shelter that isn't there. Forward stabs the pawn to f5, prying open the king's last shelter. Desperate, black captures on f5, clearing lines before the queen breaks in. Instantly the pawn takes back on f5, now a dagger at the king. Throwing up a wall, Tal pushes a pawn to f6 against the closing attack. Look, Savon's bishop walks straight into e6, baiting the rook. The quiet rook to e1 kept the squeeze, he springs the trap. Tal grabs the bishop with his rook, but a quiet queen to a6 would have held. Taking it walks into the snare. That f5 pawn snatches the rook on e6, and white is up the exchange, still attacking. Clutching on, black's queen recaptures on e6 as the position collapses. Without pause, the rook lifts to e1, every white piece aimed at the king. Retreating, Tal's queen falls back to d7, trying to knit the defense together. Suddenly the queen crashes to h8 with check, hauling Tal's king into the open. Fleeing, Tal's king runs to f7, nowhere safe to land. Relentless, the queen drops to h5 with check, the net pulling tighter. Staggering, black's king lurches back to f8, out of squares and out of hope. There it is, the queen lands on g6. Mate looms, escape gone, and Tal lays down his king. Savon has slain the legend.